Hello, I'm Anita McVeigh. Right now, it's time for BBC Your Voice. Over the next 30 minutes, our panel of experts will be answering your questions on the meningitis outbreak in Kent that has claimed the lives of two people, a 21-year-old university student and a sixth form pupil. Joining me in the studio is our health correspondent, Nick Triggle. And also joining us, we have Dr. Liz Whittaker, Professor of Practice at Imperial College London, and microbiologist, Professor Paul Hunter. Welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us to answer the questions from our viewers. Now, let's begin, Nick, with you. And I want to get the very latest on this outbreak. Just tell us where we are.
A lot has been happening today. This morning it was announced there were 5 new cases, bringing the total to 20. On the University of Kent campus, they've started offering vaccines to around 5,000 students have been offered that. And just in the past hour, we've heard that the UK Health Security Agency has launched what is called a public health alert. This is a signal essentially to the health system to be on the lookout for meningitis cases, that this is a sort of treatment that should be given, and how to follow up close contacts. I think it's important to add, this is very much for the system rather than the public. It's not a sign or a suggestion that this outbreak is going to spread nationwide. Experts are still saying this is not another COVID, but they just want to take the precautions and ensure that everyone, all the health system across England knows what to do.
And Nick, just to follow up on that, what can you say about the other university in Kent that has reported 2 cases, confirmed 2 cases in fact?
So the Canterbury University has confirmed cases. These are among the 20 that we know about. What we're finding out is detail about where these people were from, the schools they're from, and in this case, the university they're from. Important to point out that in Canterbury, 2 universities, they share a lot of similar facilities. The students there will be mixing in the same sort of social environments. Meningitis doesn't transmit easily. It requires very close contact. That's things such as kissing, sharing drinks and sharing vapes. It's not like flu or measles. And for example, one expert said to me that sitting on a bus next to someone isn't considered a risk. So I think that's perhaps helpful context for people who are worried about how quickly this is spreading.
OK, well, let's explore that a bit more now with Professor Paul Hunter. Paul, good to have you with us. Yes, give us some more information on how meningitis spreads. And also, why is this outbreak so unusual, unprecedented, in fact, is the word that the Health Secretary has used?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that clusters of meningococcal disease are not unusual. We see clusters most years, and most years we probably see more than 1 or 2 clusters. However, most of the clusters that we see, and the clusters that I investigated when I was before I became an academic, was 2 or 3 cases. This is unusual and exceptional in just because of the large number of cases. 20 cases over such a relatively short time of only just a little more than a week. That is what is unprecedented, the size and the rapid appearance of those cases. Meningococcal disease is spread generally by close contact. It's the bacteria that causes meningitis is actually often present in our throats anyway. At any one time, maybe 1 in 10 people are carrying the bacteria in their throat, and that's even higher, 1 in 5 people in adolescence. It spreads between people really by sharing saliva, so kissing on the mouth, not just on the cheeks. Sharing things that you put in your mouth. One of the classic examples is bottles of beer that people pass around, other utensils as well. Generally, also household contacts, people who you actually live with. So even though you might not be that close to them in the house, you're spending a lot of time with them. So it's not very infectious, but when it does, it can spread between people with close contact.
OK, let's bring you in now, Dr. Liz Whittaker. Welcome as well. A couple of questions for you. Is there any guidance for GPs' surgeries regarding the meningitis outbreak in Kent? Is the first of those.
Thanks. So for GP surgeries outside the immediate outbreak area, this should be practice as normal. So if a young person has left the Canterbury area but is identified as a contact, then they may ask you to prescribe antibiotics for them as per national guidance, and that is available in the BNF but also on the UKHSA website if you're looking for that. It is important to note that the antibiotics are quite reliable in terms of clearing your nasopharynx of the bacteria, but occasionally people can become infected anyway. So if they become unwell, we should assume they may have meningococcal disease and they would need antibiotics, and they should go straight to the emergency department for that after having the antibiotics. Other than that, it's the usual thing is to have awareness about sepsis, which GPs do really well. They're very good at identifying very unwell patients, and that recommendation hasn't changed. And there is no change in the recommendation in terms of vaccination for the normal population. There is obviously the outbreak response vaccination, which will be managed by the team in the Canterbury area and for appropriate contacts in that field.
And another question for you, Liz. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about teenagers, young adults getting vaccinations and antibiotics and so on. But this question is, should older people get a meningitis B vaccination?
Thanks. So the meningococcal B vaccine, Bexsero, is the vaccine that we're using in the UK, is offered in infancy. They get 3 doses in the first year of life. And the reason that the vaccine programme offers it only to that age group is because that is the age that is most likely to get meningococcal B infection. So the epidemiology informs the vaccine programme. And we have given that to babies since 2015. The biggest group of cases occurs in children under a year, and then there is the second biggest group is in children between 1 and 5 years, but that is smaller than the under ones. And then this next group is the 15 to 19-year-olds, but that is a much smaller group compared to the babies. And then when you look into adulthood, the cases are even less common. So this is the reason why the vaccine programme has targeted infants for the meningococcal B vaccine. Adolescents are offered a MenACWY vaccine because in epidemiological in the last 20 years, those are the strains of meningococcal infection that have traditionally caused the most disease in that age group, and that's why they're offered that vaccine. The other vaccine programme where people might be offered a vaccine is if they're travelling to high-risk settings, and that would include going to Umbra or Hajj, or potentially travelling to work in the meningitis belt in sub-Saharan Africa. But otherwise, there really isn't an indication for any other age group to be offered vaccine. So just to say, of course, patients who are at high risk of meningococcus because they don't have a spleen, for example, will also be offered the meningococcal vaccine.
OK, very comprehensive. Back to you, Professor Paul Hunter. Why are teenagers then more susceptible to contracting meningitis B?
Well, the first thing is that they engage in activities that are more likely to spread the infection, which we've already discussed: kissing, sharing bottles, living in fairly close, cramped environments. And the typical group these days is freshers during their first year at university. A few decades ago, it was the main risk was military recruits, people who were young adolescents who were going into the forces and then living in barracks. The second reason is that when you grow up in an environment, you are regularly exposed to meningococci and are often colonized, and those colonizing bacteria actually, even if they don't cause disease, they actually give you some sort of immunization effect. So you do get a degree of protection. But when you go to an environment that's away from home, there are people there from all over the country and probably wider areas as well. And they may have strains that you've actually never experienced before. So it's a combination of more behavioral, exposing you to the probability of exposure, linked to the fact that those strains are probably different to what you've grown up with, and therefore you're less immune.
OK, and another one for you, Paul. Does it spread as fast as COVID-19?
Oh, nowhere near. I mean, the typically outbreaks of meningococcal disease have got fairly short transmission chains. You would rarely see more than about 2 or 3 onward transmission events, because the reproductive rate, the R0, is quite close to 1. And of course, with COVID, the R0 with the current strains probably are around 8, so that an individual person could infect up to 8 people with COVID. So it is a very different situation altogether.
Yeah, a big contrast. Okay, let's come back to our health correspondent, Nick Triggle. Nick, this is quite a difficult question to answer in some ways, because it depends on the individual, but how worried should people be about this infection and this cluster of infections?
Well, I was talking to one infectious disease expert earlier today, and they were saying it's so important to keep this in context. The risk to people, even people in Kent, is very, very small. There's around 300 to 400 invasive meningitis cases every year. So it's a very, very small number. I think one of the challenges at the moment for the government, for media as well, is the communication on this, because in one respect we're hearing that this is unprecedented, it's explosive outbreak, we've had a super spreader event, and all those things are true. And Professor Hunter, when I spoke to him, said he hasn't seen an outbreak like this in his whole career. So it's a very unusual outbreak. But everything about meningitis, the way it transmits, suggests that this, whilst it's a very bad local outbreak and 2 people have sadly died and there's people seriously ill in hospital and it needs to be taken very, very seriously, the threat of it spreading more widely, that everyone, I think experts are agreed, is very, very low risk. And it's kind of understanding that context and understanding the way this infection works, that is very difficult when we see all the headlines, but I think something we need to keep in mind.
And another one for you, Nick. A viewer asks, have the health authorities reacted quickly enough?
Well, questions are being asked about that. Invasive meningitis is what's known as an urgent notifiable disease, and that means that doctors and other health staff, as soon as they suspect a case, they don't have to even have it confirmed, they should notify health protection agencies. That's a UK health security agency. Now, I spoke to the UK HSA. They were first notified of a suspected case on Friday evening. On Saturday morning, French authorities, an exchange student who had been to Kent and gone back home, the French authorities notified the UK HSA. And then by Saturday night, there was a whole cluster. 3 university students were rushed, blue lighted from the campus to hospital. And that's when the alarm was raised. But as I understand it, there were patients in hospital before the weekend. And now I've put this to the NHS trust in question, East Kent hospitals. They haven't responded to our questions, but talking to some sources at the UK HSA, the question being asked is whether the NHS quite notified them quickly enough. Now, this won't make a difference to the cases we're seeing now. Those cases are linked to infections from a week or 2 ago, but it would have allowed perhaps a quicker containment response and antibiotics to be given to the students.
I'm just going to go back to Liz and Paul and go back to that previous question that I put to Nick about how worried should we be about the outbreak, and Nick was saying, would you agree with what Nick was saying in response to that?
Yes, thanks. Definitely. I think it is a dreadful disease if you're involved in it, but it is very rare for the general public. So I think it's almost certainly going to die out of its own accord over the coming days, but that doesn't mean to say we can guarantee that, and we do need, and the UK Health Security Agency needs to be very cautious about making sure that we continue to monitor this, that it isn't going to become something more widespread.
Yeah, and Liz, your response to that as well, because I think a lot of people will be considering the fact that students will be breaking up for Easter shortly. They'll be heading back to all different parts of the country, different parts of the world potentially, and feeling concerned about that.
Yeah, I think that we need to keep this into context, as Nick and Prof Hunter have already said. This is a rare outbreak, which actually now is in the containment phase, with a really good response from UKHSA in terms of antibiotics and now a vaccine plan. And for the vast majority of the population, this is something that isn't going to affect them. I think it's appropriate that anyone who's been in contact gets appropriate post-exposure prophylaxis, but for everyone else, we don't need to raise our concern any higher. And as always, I would just say to young people that they need to be aware of their friends and look after them, because sepsis can affect anyone. And just to pick up, this is sepsis and not just meningitis. And that's why it's really important that if your friend tells you that they're not feeling very well, go and check on them a couple of hours later, make sure that they're looked after, because I think that's the key thing for everybody all the time, just so that we know we're looking after each other.
Okay, all very good advice. I'll stay with you, Dr. Liz Whittaker. Our viewer Marta asks, my daughter was vaccinated for various meningitis. She doesn't say what specific strains in 2019. Is she still protected? So if you could give us an overview based on the vaccinations for the various types of meningitis.
So we have a very comprehensive vaccine schedule in the UK. We're very lucky. So we cover in the infant schedule meningococcal infections, such as this outbreak that we're talking about now with the Men B. We also cover Men C, and we cover Haemophilus, which is a bacteria which can cause meningitis, as well as pneumococcus. And those vaccines are given in the infant year and as preschool boosters. And apart from the Men B, give quite long-lasting protection. The Men B vaccine, which is given in infancy, protects for probably about 5 years. I think that it doesn't have very long-lasting protection, but as I said earlier, actually it's quite rare to see cases outside of that age group, and that's why we don't necessarily offer a booster. In addition, you may be talking about MMR, which obviously that protection is lifelong, and you can get brain infection from the measles and the mumps viruses, which are in that vaccine. Finally, then adolescents get a meningococcal ACWY vaccine in school, and that also gives quite long-lasting protection. I think what we really need to do is make sure that everybody accesses the vaccines that are available to them, because that's actually going to have the greatest impact in preventing vaccine-preventable infections. So make sure that you know that your child or yourself are up to date with your vaccines, have a look at your record, and if not, make an appointment with your GP to get those vaccines, because that's going to have a much greater impact in protecting you and giving herd immunity to those around you in terms of protection from meningitis.
Yes, that herd immunity concept, obviously very important, something that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks. Professor Paul Hunter, back to you now. And someone is asking, how quickly does it take for the vaccine to work?
Yeah, that's not quite as an easy question to answer, really, because typically with most vaccines, you sort of think about, for the first shot, about 3 weeks before they become effective. The thing with meningococcal disease, however, is that often we've already been vaccinated, as it were, by other strains that are around, so that we might actually have more rapid development of immunity than that. But again, I would just point out that the meningococcal B vaccine doesn't necessarily protect against all strains of the meningococcus. There are well over 100 different variants of meningococcus B circulating, and the vaccines don't protect against all of those variants. Now, I'm assuming that in this case we know that the strain is in fact controlled by vaccine, they will be able to. So I'll start again. So after you've had the vaccine, you cannot immediately assume that you're not going to get disease. So if you get ill,
and there are two
vaccine,
jabs, aren't there? There are 2 jabs, just to point out, for
yes.
meningitis B. Yes.
Yeah. But after the first one, you get some protection after about 3 weeks. So even after you've had the vaccine, you still can't assume that you're totally protected. So even vaccinated, if you're developing these sorts of symptoms, still take them seriously.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Nick, back to you. Are there sufficient vaccine stocks to deal with the demand, is the next question.
Well, a lot of people have been asking about getting the meningitis B vaccine for young adults, teenagers who wouldn't have been vaccinated as babies. That meningitis B vaccination campaign only began 10 years ago, so anyone over the age of 11 hasn't had it on the NHS. And there has been, talking to pharmacies, a huge rush. Some pharmacies have reported they've run out of that vaccine. The NHS, though, has its own supplies. And of course, today we started seeing in Kent students being given the vaccine as a preventative measure. This is to provide them with some immunity in the long term in case this strain keeps spreading. And I was talking to the UK Health Security Agency about whether that would be a match, because as Professor Hunter says, the vaccine isn't a match for all the strains that fall under the meningitis B umbrella. And they're still doing the testing, but they have got some results back, and they believe it is a good match. So it will provide, they believe, some good protection for those students in Kent.
OK, back to Dr. Liz Whittaker now. Liz, our next viewer asks, can I get the vaccine for free, or do I have to pay for it at a pharmacy as I do at the moment for a COVID booster?
So if it is being given out of the schedule, then you would have to pay to have it privately. So, as I said before, infants are offered this as part of the vaccine schedule, and other vaccines against meningococcal are offered for different indications, and otherwise it's only available privately. I guess the question you need to ask is it indicated at this time, and what protection is it going to offer? The risk at the moment is no greater than it was last week. And so it's important to not get overwhelmed with worry about this particular outbreak. If you live, for example, in Wales, it is unlikely that your risk is any different. And so this is something that some people get privately, but it's not available on the NHS.
OK. Professor Paul Hunter, following on from that, how vulnerable are adults in the wider London communities for catching meningitis B, asks the next viewer.
As I said earlier, the risk of meningococcal B infection is very low for the general public. Typically, within the age group, we see about 1 or 2 cases per 100,000 people per year. So it is very rare. There are some patients who are most at risk. There's some types of immune deficiency that are associated with recurrent and repeat meningococcal infections. But by and large, those people will have been identified, and they will already been offered meningococcal B vaccine as part of their management of their underlying condition. But the main risk is very low,
Basically, the message, I think, from all of you today is to everyone is not to panic, not to over-worry. Certainly if you're not in the area immediately affected by this outbreak. I think we've got time probably just for a couple more questions. And Liz, back to you, Dr. Liz Whittaker. Someone asks, how effective are antibiotics when someone has meningitis B?
So the good news is that antibiotics are very effective. So Neisseria meningitidis, the bacteria that causes meningococcal meningitis and sepsis, is actually very sensitive even to penicillin, which is our most basic antibiotic that we have. So that's really good news. And so actually the antibiotic prophylaxis that UKHSA has been giving to the students in Canterbury is likely to clear that bacteria from their throats quite quickly. And I think that the vaccination planned is a belts and braces to prevent further infection. So that is really good news for us. And can I just clarify again that everybody should always be aware of when to worry about sepsis and meningitis, regardless of this outbreak. So knowing that if you have a fever, headache, neck stiffness, cold hands and feet and lethargy and becoming sicker very quickly, that patients like that should always talk to NHS 111 or seek medical attention quickly, regardless of the outbreak.
OK, yeah, that's something that needs to be attended to really quickly, a very important message. We've only got a minute left. Nick, in just a few seconds, what has the government response been to the outbreak?
Well, the Health Secretary made an urgent statement yesterday. He gave media interviews today. He is asking the JCVI that advises the government on vaccinations, whether meningitis B should be a catch-up programme should be given. So I think that's one to watch. I think the other thing is we are going to get daily updates from the UK Health Security Agency about numbers of cases. They will be updating us with that at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow.
OK. That's our health correspondent, Nick Triggle. Nick, thank you very much. Also, Dr. Liz Whittaker, Professor of Practice at Imperial College London, and also Professor Paul Hunter, microbiologist. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise and answering our viewers' questions. Thanks to you for sending those questions in. Do stay with us here on BBC News.